They've surrounded us. Human, she whispered, trembling. Good, he growled. Now I don't even have to aim. The red dust swirled across the barren wasteland, painting the horizon in shades of rust and blood. On this desolate planet in the outer rim, the perpetual dust-laden sky filtered the harsh sunlight into an oppressive crimson glow. Jagged rock formations pierced the landscape like the bones of some ancient beast, casting long shadows across the sand. In the center of this hellscape, two figures knelt in the dust, their hands bound behind them. Sar, a tall Zeta warrior with battle-worn armor that had once gleamed with the pride of her people, now slumped forward, her side seeping with blood from a deep wound. Next to her, Riv Harrow, a human engineer with a peculiar calmness about him, surveyed their surroundings with calculating gray eyes. His tattered clothes bore the marks of recent combat, yet his expression remained eerily composed. The silence of the desert was broken only by the whistle of wind through stone and the distant, rhythmic footfalls of their captors approaching. No rescue would come. No allies would emerge from the dust. They were utterly alone. Sar winced as a fresh wave of pain surged through her wounded side. The once proud warrior of the Zeta Alliance had led countless, successful reconnaissance missions across hostile territories. Now, her fractured composite armor barely held together, its protective seals compromised, much like her resolve. She stared at the ground, counting the moments until their execution. Riv Harrow, however, studied the movements around them with unnerving intensity. His slender frame belied his resilience, and despite his disheveled appearance, there was something in his eyes, a certainty, a calculation that seemed out of place for a prisoner awaiting death. The wind carried the scent of metallic blood and alien sweat. The temperature dropped as the twin suns began their descent behind the jagged mountains. Everything pointed to a grim finality. Then they appeared, warriors of the Pincer tribe emerging from all directions, forming a tightening circle around the captives. Their tall, imposing figures were adorned with bone ornaments and ritual scarification. Each carried a spear tipped with a metal alloy that caught the dying light. Their leader, Chieftain Teg Rock, towered above the others, his shoulders bearing the massive skull of some reptilian beast, a symbol of his authority and cruelty. As the circle of warriors closed in, their spears forming an inescapable wall of deadly points, Sar felt the last ember of hope extinguish within her chest. She turned to Riv, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They've surrounded us. Human," she whispered, trembling not from fear, but from the pain of her wounds and the weight of their failure. Riv's lips curled into what could almost be called a smile. "Good," he growled, his eyes never leaving the approaching wall of enemies. "Now I don't even have to aim." Before Sar could question his response, the Pincer warriors seized them both, dragging them to the center of the circle. Teg Rock stepped forward, his voice a guttural rumble as he pronounced their sentence in the common language. Death at dawn, a sacrifice to the bone gods of the Pincer tribe. As they were thrown back to the ground, Sar's mind raced with desperation. How had it come to this? What strange comfort did her human companion find in their dire circumstances? And why did his confidence, bordering on arrogance, feel like the only solid thing to cling to in this sea of despair? 5 days earlier, while Sar had focused on mapping potential escape routes, Riv had been observing the Pincer outpost with methodical precision. He had spent hours motionless behind a ridge of red rock, tracking the movements of guards, noting the patterns in their patrol rotations, and memorizing their sacred rituals. 47 steps from the main gate to the first checkpoint, he had muttered to himself, fingers twitching as if writing invisible notes. 32 steps to the fire pit, 18 to the command tent. Sar had dismissed his obsessive counting as a human quirk, preferring to focus on combat strategies and potential weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. But Riv had been building something in his mind, a mathematical model of their enemy's behavior, calculating probabilities and planning contingencies with machine-like precision. 3 days before their capture, while Sar had slept fitfully, Riv had crept into the periphery of the pincer camp. Moving with surprising stealth for an engineer, he had approached the ritual bone pile at the edge of the central fire pit. This mound of skeletal remains served as both altar and warning, a sacred monument to the pincer's gods and a testament to their merciless treatment of enemies. Under the light of 3 moons, Riv had carefully altered several of the bone pieces, etching blasphemous symbols into the sacred carvings. His modifications were subtle enough to escape immediate notice, but positioned precisely where they would be revealed when illuminated by specific frequencies of sound, frequencies he had calculated from studying the pincer's ceremonial horns. "Superstition is predictable," he had whispered to the night, "and the predictable can be weaponized." 2 days before their capture, Riv had salvaged components from a crashed scout ship, extracting the power core that remained intact despite the vessel's destruction. Working with improvised tools, he had constructed an acoustic charge calibrated to resonate with the surrounding rock formations. When activated, it would generate sound waves capable of destabilizing the cliff face above the main pincer encampment. But Riv's engineering didn't stop there. He had adjusted the frequency to match the mating call of the arachnobeast, 8-legged predators that haunted the stone forests beyond the desert's edge. These creatures, with their metal-like claws and razor-sharp teeth, were the apex predators of this desolate world, feared even by the pincer warriors. "Systems within systems," Riv had murmured as he concealed the device in a crevice high above the anticipated battlefield. "Every ecosystem has its breaking point." Throughout these preparations, Sar had grown increasingly skeptical of Riv's methods. As a warrior trained in direct combat, she valued strength, honor, and tactical superiority, not the clandestine manipulations that seemed to occupy the human's mind. "What good are your tricks?" she had challenged him. "When they have 3 times our numbers and know this terrain better than we ever could." Riv had merely shrugged, his focus unwavering as he made minute adjustments to his devices. "Numbers are just variables in an equation," he had replied. "And terrain is only an advantage when you understand its properties." Now, as they knelt in the dust, awaiting execution, Sar felt the weight of hopelessness crushing her spirit. Her training had prepared her for honorable death in battle, not this ignoble end as a sacrificial offering. She had been taught to believe in the strength of allies, the power of unified resistance, but here, at the edge of known space, those beliefs seemed as insubstantial as the dust clouds swirling around them. "How can we possibly survive this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Riv's eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings, cataloging details that seemed insignificant to Sar. "We don't have to survive," he replied cryptically. "We just have to ensure they don't." As the night deepened, the pincer warriors set up a perimeter, positioning 3 distinct battalions around their position. The northern battalion claimed the high ground atop the cliff, their silhouettes stark against the star-filled sky. The western battalion secured the flanking position, blocking any potential escape route through the narrow pass between towering rock formations. The main battalion formed an imposing wall of spears directly before them, their discipline evident in their perfect formation. Sar assessed each group with a warrior's eye, counting their numbers and evaluating their armaments. The northern battalion consisted of approximately 40 warriors, specialized in ranged attacks with their bone-tipped projectiles. The western battalion, smaller at around 30 fighters, were defensive specialists, their shields forming an impenetrable barrier. The main battalion, the largest with 70 warriors, represented the elite fighting force of the pincer tribe, their spears longer and their armor more elaborate than the others. "They've positioned themselves perfectly for an execution," Sar observed bitterly. "No gaps, no weaknesses." Riv nodded, but there was something in his expression, a glint of satisfaction that confused Sar. "They've positioned themselves exactly where I need them to be," he corrected her. As dawn approached, the air grew colder, and the stars began to fade from the crimson sky. The pincer warriors became more active, preparing for the morning ritual that would culminate in the execution of their prisoners. Ritual drums began a slow, ominous beat that echoed across the desert landscape. Sar felt her heart race with the primal fear of imminent death. Despite her warrior's training, despite her countless battles and near-death experiences, she found herself trembling. The wound in her side throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of her mortality. "I never thought it would end like this," she admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. Not as a sacrifice to some primitive deity on a forgotten planet. Riv turned to her then, and for the first time, she saw something beyond calculation in his eyes, a glimpse of humanity, perhaps even compassion. "It won't end here," he said quietly. "But what comes next requires trust. Can you trust me, Sar of the Zeta?" Before she could answer, the drumbeat intensified, and Tegrak approached, flanked by his most decorated warriors. The chieftain's face was a map of ritual scars, each marking a victory or a sacrifice to the bone gods. In his hand, he carried an ancient horn carved from some massive creature's tusk, its surface covered in symbols, similar to those etched on the sacred bone pile. "The dawn comes," Tegrak announced, his voice carrying across the assembly. "And with it, the blessing of the bone gods as they receive your souls." He raised the horn to his lips, preparing to sound the call that would signal the beginning of the execution ritual. At that precise moment, Riv tensed beside Sar, his muscles coiled like springs, ready to release. "Now," he whispered, so softly that only she could hear. "Watch the system collapse." Tegrak blew the ceremonial horn, its deep, resonant tone washing over the assembled warriors. But as the sound reached the altered bone pile, something unexpected happened. The blasphemous symbols Riv had etched into the sacred bones became visible, illuminated by the specific frequency of the horn's call. A collective gasp rose from the northern battalion as the warriors nearest to the bone pile recognized the desecration. Panicked shouts erupted as the more devout among them fell to their knees, convinced they were witnessing a manifestation of divine wrath. Others turned on their companions, accusing them of the sacrilege, their discipline fracturing as religious terror overrode their military training. Simultaneously, the sound waves from the horn triggered Riv's hidden acoustic device. A high-pitched whine, imperceptible to most ears, emanated from the cliff face above the pincer encampment. The rock, already weakened by natural fissures, began to vibrate at its resonant frequency. Hairline cracks appeared, spreading like lightning across the stone surface. Before the pincer warriors could react to the chaos in their ranks, the cliff face shuddered and gave way. Massive boulders cascaded down onto the Western Battalion, crushing shields and warriors alike. The perfectly coordinated defensive line dissolved into a chaotic scramble for survival as warriors dove for cover or were buried beneath tons of falling rock. But the acoustic device had one more function, a function Riv had calibrated with scientific precision. The frequency it emitted carried beyond the encampment, into the stone forest that bordered the desert. There, it mimicked the mating call of the arachnobeast, a sound that triggered a primal response in the predatory creatures. From the shadows between towering rock formations, they emerged, massive eight-legged beasts with metallic claws and glistening fangs. Drawn by the irresistible call, they converged on the pincer encampment, their hunger awakened by the promise of prey. The main battalion, still maintaining formation despite the chaos erupting around them, was the first to face the onslaught of the arachnobeasts. The disciplined wall of spears, meant to execute 2 prisoners, now faced a nightmare of chitinous limbs and slashing claws. Warrior after warrior fell, their training insufficient against the primal ferocity of the predators. Sar watched in stunned silence as the carefully orchestrated execution transformed into a scene of utter chaos. The Northern Battalion, caught in religious panic, turned their weapons on each other or fled in terror. The Western Battalion lay crushed beneath rubble, survivors struggling to free themselves or their comrades. The main battalion fought desperately against the arachnobeasts, their formation shattered, their discipline meaningless in the face of such unexpected horror. "You planned this," Sar whispered, understanding dawning like the blood-red sun above them. "All of it." Riv nodded, his eyes reflecting the destruction around them. "Every system has vulnerabilities," he said. "Religious devotion, military discipline, territorial instinct, all predictable, all exploitable." As they watched, Teg Rock bellowed commands that went unheeded in the chaos. The chieftain, symbol of absolute authority among the pincer, found his power meaningless as the three pillars of his society: religious belief, military structure, and environmental control collapsed simultaneously. "We need to move," Riv said, his voice cutting through Sar's stunned contemplation. The bonds they used, standard fiber cords. The tensile strength degrades by 60% when exposed to the acids in pincer sweat. "Our restraints have been weakening since they bound us." With a sharp twist of his wrists, Riv broke free of his bonds. He quickly moved to release Sar, his fingers working with the precision of an engineer accustomed to delicate adjustments. "Can you walk?" he asked, eyeing her wounded side. Sar tested her weight, grimacing at the pain but nodding firmly. "I can fight if necessary." "It won't be," Riv assured her, gesturing to the complete disintegration of the pincer forces around them. "The system is in free fall now. They've become their own worst enemies." They moved cautiously through the chaos, avoiding the attention of both panicked warriors and hunting arachnobeasts. The discipline that had made the pincer tribe so formidable was now their greatest weakness. Trained to follow orders and maintain formation, they struggled to adapt to the multifaceted catastrophe engulfing them. As they reached the edge of the encampment, a young pincer warrior stepped into their path. Utak, barely into adulthood by his tribe's standards, clutched his spear with trembling hands. His face, not yet fully marked with the ritual scars of his people, showed naked fear rather than the stoic determination of his elders. Sar tensed, preparing to fight despite her injuries. But Riv stepped forward, his empty hands raised in a gesture that transcended language barriers. "Perhaps we're no longer enemies," he said calmly, as if addressing a colleague rather than an armed opponent. The young warrior looked past them at the destruction of his tribe's forces, at the religious panic and the deadly arachnobeasts. In his eyes, Sar saw the collapse of certainty, the realization that everything he had been taught about power, about divine favor, about the invincibility of his people, had been proven false in a single, catastrophic morning. Utak lowered his spear, nodded once in acknowledgement, and stepped aside to let them pass before disappearing into the chaos of the battlefield. "Why did you spare him?" Sar asked, as they made their way toward the narrow pass that would lead them away from the encampment. "Systems require individuals to perpetuate them," Riv explained. "But individuals can choose to build different systems." He made his choice. They climbed through the debris of the collapsed cliff face, picking their way over shattered rock and the occasional broken body of a pincer warrior. The sounds of battle, the screams of the dying, the roars of the arachnobeasts, the panicked shouts of warriors, gradually faded behind them. At the crest of a red dune, they paused to look back. The pincer encampment, once a model of military precision and religious authority, had descended into complete anarchy. Warriors fought against predators, against each other, or simply fled into the desert. The three battalions, so carefully positioned for execution, had dissolved into individual survivors with no cohesion or purpose. "It's all falling apart exactly as you calculated," Sar observed, her voice a mixture of awe and horror. "Systems theory applied to social structures," Riv replied, a hint of professional satisfaction in his tone. "Identify the critical nodes, apply precisely calibrated pressure, and watch the cascade effect." As they continued their journey across the red wasteland, Sar found herself examining her companion with new eyes. The human engineer, whom she had initially dismissed as physically inferior and tactically naive, had orchestrated the complete collapse of a tribal society using nothing but observation, analysis, and a few improvised devices. "You said earlier that you didn't need to aim," she recalled. "What did you mean?" Riv's expression softened, revealing the humanity beneath the calculating exterior. "In traditional combat, you aim at your enemy, a direct application of force," he explained. "But when you understand systems, you realize that direct force is often inefficient. It's better to identify the critical points where minimal input can trigger maximum change." "Like turning their religious symbols against them," Sar noted, "and their military discipline, and their environmental adaptations," Riv added. "None of those systems were inherently flawed in isolation, but when stressed simultaneously, they created a self-reinforcing failure cascade." They walked in silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. The twin suns climbed higher in the crimson sky, baking the landscape and causing heat mirages to shimmer on the horizon. Sar's wound throbbed with each step, but the bleeding had slowed, and her Zeta physiology was already beginning the accelerated healing process. "You've done this before," she said finally. Not a question, but a realization. Riv's expression darkened. "Cathara Prime," he confirmed. "Similar tribal structure, different vulnerabilities." The name sent a chill through Sar despite the desert heat. Cathara Prime had been a bloody conflict early in the war, a planet where human settlers had been massacred by indigenous forces, only for those forces to mysteriously collapse into internal conflict shortly thereafter. The official reports had attributed it to tribal infighting, but rumors had circulated about covert operations and engineered societal collapse. "You were there," she stated. "I lost people there," Riv corrected, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "And I learned that direct confrontation is rarely the optimal solution when dealing with complex social systems." They reached a plateau, overlooking a vast plain of red sand, stretching toward the distant horizon. Far below, they could see a glint of metal, their extraction point, still operational despite the failure of their reconnaissance mission. Salvation was within reach. As they began their descent, Sar felt a piece of her armor give way, the fractured composite finally surrendering to the damage it had sustained. The plate clattered to the ground, raising a small cloud of crimson dust. She stared at it for a moment, this symbol of her identity as a Zeta warrior, now broken and useless. Without thinking, she reached for the release mechanisms on her remaining armor pieces. One by one, they fell away, leaving her in the simple undersuit that all Zeta warriors wore beneath their protective shells. She felt lighter, unburdened, not just physically but spiritually. Riv watched her transformation with quiet understanding. "The armor doesn't make the warrior," he observed. "Nor the calculations the man," she replied, a new respect in her voice. Together, they continued toward the extraction point. Two figures diminished against the vastness of the red desert. Behind them, the echoes of destruction gradually faded, the death throes of a society that had believed itself invincible until the moment of its collapse. In the command center of the extraction vessel, Sar received medical attention while Riv filed his report. The mission parameters had technically been fulfilled. The pincer threat to Alliance operations in the sector had been neutralized, though not in the manner originally intended. "Will your superiors approve of your methods?" Sar asked, as a medical drone sealed her wound with synthetic tissue. Riv shrugged, his attention focused on the data scrolling across his terminal. "Results justify methods in their calculation. The algorithm of military approval is surprisingly simple." "And what about you?" she pressed. "Does the engineer approve of his own creation?" Riv's fingers paused over the interface, and for a moment, Sar glimpsed something beneath the analytical facade. Regret, perhaps, or simply the weight of responsibility. Systems collapse has consequences beyond the immediate objective, he admitted. The Pincer Society wasn't inherently malevolent, just incompatible with our presence. Their religion, their military structure, their social hierarchies, all developed to help them survive in a hostile environment. Yet you dismantled it all in a single morning. Because I could, Riv said softly. Because the equation balanced in our favor. Because the alternative was our execution and continued pincer expansion into Alliance territory. SAR considered this as the medical drone completed its work and powered down. The pain in her side had subsided to a dull ache. Her accelerated healing now assisted by Alliance medical technology. On my world, she said finally, we have a concept called Sharkiva, the honorable wound. It's a recognition that victory without cost lacks meaning, that strength emerges from struggle. Riv nodded slowly. And what wound do you carry from today's victory, SAR of the Zeta? She touched her healed side, but her gesture encompassed more than the physical injury. The knowledge that everything I believed about warfare, about honor, about the path to victory, it was incomplete, perhaps even flawed. Not flawed, Riv corrected her. Just optimized for a different set of variables. Direct combat has its place, but so does systems thinking. As the extraction vessel broke atmosphere, leaving the red planet behind, SAR looked out at the star-filled void of space. Somewhere in that vastness, other conflicts waited. Other systems existed in fragile equilibrium, and she would approach them differently now, with a warrior's courage, complemented by an engineer's understanding of interconnected systems. They surrounded us, she mused, echoing her words from the desert. And that was their mistake. Riv's lips curled into a rare, genuine smile. Perfect positioning requires perfect understanding of the battlefield. They had the former without the latter. Is that why you didn't need to aim? She asked. Because they positioned themselves in their own trap? Precisely, Riv confirmed. The best targets are the ones that place themselves in the crosshairs, convinced they're the hunters rather than the hunted. Together, they watch the red planet dwindle to a point of light and then vanish among the stars. One battlefield among many in a galaxy full of systems waiting to be understood, manipulated, or perhaps, with this new alliance of warrior and engineer, reformed into something better. The extraction vessel accelerated to jump speed, leaving behind a world forever changed by the application of calculated pressure to critical points of vulnerability. In the vacuum of space, no one heard the final echoes of a society's collapse, but in the minds of SAR and Riv, the lessons resonated with profound implications for conflicts yet to come. Months later, SAR stood on the observation deck of an Alliance cruiser, watching the stars streak by as they traveled at faster-than-light speeds. Her side had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar as a reminder of the red planet. She had declined a full armor replacement, opting instead for a lighter, more flexible design that incorporated some of Riv's engineering principles, strength at critical points, rather than comprehensive coverage. Riv joined her at the viewport. His own appearance transformed as well. Gone were the tattered clothes of a prisoner. He now wore the precision-cut uniform of the Alliance Engineering Corps, though he had customized it with elements that reflected his unique approach to his profession. New assignment, he said without preamble, handing her a data crystal. Outer Rim, uncharted territory. Indigenous population with complex religious structure and advanced territorial defenses. SAR accepted the crystal, turning it in her fingers so that it caught the light of passing stars. Combat assessment. Conventional approach estimates 70% casualty rate for standard engagement, Riv replied, his tone clinical, but his eyes watching her reaction carefully. And your assessment? She asked, already knowing the answer. Systems analysis suggests multiple vulnerabilities that could be exploited without direct confrontation. Estimated success rate of 95% with minimal casualties on either side. Sar nodded, slipping the crystal into her pocket. Since their experience on the Red Planet, they had been assigned as a specialized unit, the warrior and the engineer, bringing complementary perspectives to conflicts across Alliance space. Their success rate had drawn attention from high command, though few understood the philosophical shift that underpinned their approach. "You've come to prefer the indirect path," Riv observed. "I've come to prefer paths that don't lead to needless graves," Sar corrected him. "Honor doesn't require blood when intelligence can achieve the same objective." Riv smiled, a genuine expression that had become more common as they continued to work together. The Zeta High Command might consider that statement heretical. "Let them," Sar replied with a shrug. "Systems can change from within as well as without. Perhaps it's time for the Zeta to evolve their concept of honorable warfare." As the cruiser prepared to drop out of faster-than-light travel, they moved toward the deployment bay, where their scout ship waited. It had been modified according to Riv's specifications, incorporating both offensive capabilities and sophisticated analysis tools. Like its operators, it represented a fusion of direct and indirect approaches to conflict resolution. "Do you ever regret it?" Sar asked, as they prepared for departure. "The pincer, Cathara Prime, all the systems you've collapsed?" Riv's expression grew thoughtful. "Regret implies a desire for different outcomes. I regret the necessity, but not the execution. In each case, the alternatives were worse." "And if someone applied your methods to the Alliance," she pressed, "identified our critical vulnerabilities, our points of systemic failure, then we would adapt or collapse," Riv said simply. "That's the nature of systems. They evolve or they die. The strongest aren't those with the most robust defenses, but those capable of transforming in response to new threats." As their scout ship detached from the cruiser and set course for the uncharted world, Sar reflected on her own transformation. The warrior, who had knelt in the red dust, awaiting execution with trembling resignation, seemed like a different person now, someone constrained by tradition and limited perception. "They've surrounded us. Human," she said suddenly, echoing their shared past as she observed the tactical display, showing the unknown territory they were about to enter. Riv glanced at the display, noting the potential danger zones and defensible positions. Then he looked at Sar, his eyes reflecting the same calculated confidence that had first bewildered and then inspired her. "Good," he replied with a predator's smile. "Now we don't even have to aim." The scout ship accelerated toward the uncharted world, carrying with it a new approach to conflict, one that recognized the power of understanding systems, rather than merely confronting them. Behind them, the Alliance cruiser receded into the distance, and ahead lay a frontier of possibilities, dangers, and societies yet to be understood. In the space between stars, Sar and Riv prepared once more to demonstrate that the most effective weapon was not strength or even courage, but the ability to see the interconnected nature of all things, and the wisdom to apply pressure at precisely the right points to transform conflict into opportunity. And somewhere, in the vast galaxy, the dust of the Red Planet still swirled across the ruins of a society that had never understood the nature of the trap they had set for themselves when they had surrounded a warrior and an engineer, believing themselves to be the hunters rather than the hunted. The lessons of that day continued to shape both Sar and Riv as they carried their unique alliance to new worlds and new conflicts, not as conquerors, but as architects of change, applying the principles of systems theory to the complex tapestry of galactic relations. For in the end, they had learned the most important lesson of all. True power lies not in surrounding your enemy, but in understanding the system that makes them your enemy in the first place. And in that understanding, finding the path to transformation rather than destruction.